Welcome to another edition of Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. My name is Jamal Binding. I'm the chair of the board of Movement No More for Race Equity, an organization that deals with anti-racism, transparency, accountability, and advocacy. We have a special guest today on our show, Mindy Rush Chipman, who's the executive director of ACLU of Nebraska. She was the legal director and moved to the position in 2023. Mindy has worked in various professionals and nonprofit organizations serving low-income people and marginalized clients, families, and addressing many social justice issues. I met her at one of our community events at Omaha. We did some things over at First United Methodist Church when she was the director of the Human Rights Commission in Lincoln. She's working on racial justice issues related to the criminal justice issues in Nebraska on many cases and so on. And the other aspect of that we will hopefully cover is that we will talk to her about her role as she's been at the ACLU and so on, and some of the issues they're working on. I actually at one point served on the board of directors for about 4 years at ACLU, so I got familiar with the organization, the work that they do in Nebraska. And I'm also aware of the advocacy issues that have been forefront in their work in terms of trying to change the status quo. Mindy, I'm going to start off by saying, welcome to Throwing Down Some Heavy Light, and please share a little bit more about yourself.
Thanks, Ajamal. It's really great to be here with you tonight. And thank you for the kind introduction. I see you've mined a couple of my bios online for that, but I think one of the most positive aspects of me joining the ACLU personally is this has been the first job that I've been able to work at that I can come to work as my whole self. And when I say my whole self, I mean I can talk about things that have traditionally been it felt like I had to hide them, so my father's incarceration or my needing to access abortion care when I was a young person. Those were all things that impacted me as a person, impacted me as a parent, impacted me as an attorney, but they were also things that I wasn't really comfortable being open about and sharing those experiences in a way that helped develop my career as an attorney, particularly in human rights, civil rights type of work. And so I think that is one thing that has been really beneficial for me as a person, but also for the ACLU team, really leaning into one's own lived experience and realities associated with the work that we're doing every day. So I know you and I have talked a lot about that in the past, but it's not something that is easy for a lot of people to talk about, but I'm privileged and able to do so because I'm working at the ACLU of Nebraska now.
Now, many people in the community are unaware of the ACLU Nebraska and its efforts to support residents in our state. Can you also, you alluded to it a little bit earlier, but what is your mission and the current work that you're doing at the organization now?
Sure. So the ACLU is a nationwide organization, but there are independent ACLUs in almost every state. There's 50 ACLU affiliates. There's a chapter with the Dakotas and Wyoming together, and then there's also 3 ACLU affiliates in California. But total, we have coverage across the country, and ACLU of Nebraska has been in existence for almost 60 years. Next year, we're going to celebrate our 60th anniversary. But basically, the long and short of it is we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan legal and advocacy organization. We use something that is called integrated advocacy. It's where we don't just use the litigation, going to courts as a tool, or we don't just use lobbying or working with lawmakers to influence policy in isolation. We use both of those tools in addition with community engagement to really try to make that effectuate that sustainable change in our communities. But basically, we work to defend the rights and freedoms of all Nebraskans. And I'm happy to report that the ACLU of Nebraska board recently approved a new strategic plan, 2025 to 2028, where you'll see we're kind of cementing into the priority issue areas that we've had, but finding those areas where we can affirmatively keep working to move that needle and save some capacity to be responsive to meet Nebraskans' needs when their rights and freedoms are being challenged, but still keep moving forward with working on those forward-facing goals. And Ajmal, those priority issue areas are not going to be unfamiliar to you. We are working solidly on smart justice. And when I say smart justice, that's criminal legal reform, the rights of people who are currently or previously incarcerated. So basically trying to keep people out of the system, making sure their rights are respected while they are in the system, and making sure that they leave the system not worse than when they went in. So that's kind of the picture of smart justice, like our work in the smart justice
I don't
area.
want to interrupt you. If we just had to name the top three, because I want to kind of get through a lot of the questions, what would be your top three that you see as important? I know the board voted on them, but what are those ones that stand out that the public would know that you deal with? The top three.
Well, I'll just give you all because there's not many more than that. So smart justice, immigrants' rights, indigenous justice, voting rights and democracy defense, and then bodily autonomy. And when we say bodily autonomy, really think about reproductive freedom, the rights to access the medical care that you need, things of that nature. But those are our priority issue areas that the board just approved.
Okay. Now, by the way, we've just completed the legislative session in Nebraska. Nebraskans tend to be, because of unicameral legislative centric, what happens in Lincoln. And what were the significant pieces of legislation that ACLU tracked in the past session that you focused on? And was there some unfinished business that we need to look at for next year from your vantage point?
I'm really glad you asked. Some of the high points that we can celebrate in community with the other organizations and individuals that helped include, we stopped the winner take all bill. It was LB3. We were able to facilitate hundreds upon hundreds of forms of communications to our lawmakers to make
When
sure
you
that
say
they knew.
winner take all, people who don't know legislation, what does that mean when you say that? Explain what that winner take all bill is about.
Yeah, so in Nebraska, we have a pretty unique way of of voting in the federal elections, and so we have a distinct district that encompasses a big portion of Omaha that is separated
Gotcha.
CD2. There was a bill introduced in the Nebraska legislature this last session to get rid of that distinct separate
Gotcha.
district
Makes sense.
and really eliminate, the independent voices of some folks in the metro area. So we were able to stop that bill from moving forward to keep the ability of us having that distinct CD2 vote coming out of Nebraska. We also were the only organization to testify in support of LB 519. So this was a bill that helps bring some fairness into drug testing for folks who are in the system experiencing incarceration. It's requiring some independent verification of testing results. That bill was introduced by Senator McKinney and Senator Juarez, and it passed. Governor Pillen signed it, and so we're really happy about that positive change. We also supported Senator McKinney's LB 48, which also passed. It's a pilot program for at-risk children or youth. That one passed. Unfortunately, we were not able to stop the legislation that approved of detention of children in Nebraska, 11-year-old children, in fact. But we were able to really kind of rally with other organizations and individuals to show that the support of opposition to that type of legislation, and we're able to implement some safeguards and mitigate that bill a bit. And then LB 89, that was a bill on transgender rights in Nebraska. We lost. That bill did move forward, but the amount of opposition, we were able to show senators that there was not interest in this bill like maybe they had originally thought, and we were able to mitigate some of the impact and narrow it down because it originally started as a much broader bill.
Yeah.
Three unfinished.
Switch up if I can, because I don't want to go through all the bills. I want to switch up if I can. I'm really trying to get to some, and we're going to come back to some of this when we have the time for the participants to ask questions, go for that. We have challenges to deal with police misconduct in Nebraska. We've had a number of African Americans and Latinos who've been killed, murdered by cops, unarmed citizens they have been, and also particularly in Omaha. What ways can we address the recent tragedies from the perspective of ACLU?
So the approach definitely has to be multifaceted. If we have time to go back to talk about pieces of legislation that are still in play, there's some pieces of legislation or bills that are still alive that could be helpful to this. But generally, I agree with ACLU National's recommendations that investment in community-led solutions, not over policing, is the answer. So, for example, LB 222 is still alive, and it limits when police can pull over individuals who are driving for non-safety related like allegations, but really kind of diving into limiting those interactions with community members and police. Really take a look at the use of force statutes and regulations and do a complete overhaul about police use of force. And frankly, one thing that would make a lot of difference is ending qualified immunity. A lot of times it's hard to effectuate change on the back end through litigation in a state like Nebraska, where the state or government actors have the protection of immunity and not being held responsible for their misuse of force.
So let me translate this to some people. When you say qualified immunity, it means they can do anything they want to do and never get charged in court. Is that what we're saying?
So we're talking about civil litigation afterwards. So not necessarily the criminal implications,
Or just
but you,
money. I got
yeah.
Okay, got you. Okay, I'm trying to deconstruct for different folks who may not know some of our terminology. One of the things we do in more is we're talking about accountability and transparency. And again, we don't have a lot from nonprofits and organizations. They want to show their data. You got people working behind plexiglass offices who don't return calls and so on. How do you measure the effectiveness of nonprofits or organizations serve the community or who work on specific issues? You can talk about your own organization or just what you see as a person who's worked in various professional capacities. Accountability, transparency, and how do you determine that people are being accountable in a sense?
Yeah, well, Ajmal, I think you are an expert in this area as far as more transparency and accountability. But I really do think it depends on the specific organization and the work that they're doing. So like an organization can prepare maybe a report with some statistics to talk about policies or individuals served in a particular area. Like we all know that that is something that nonprofits generally can do better at. And like you've been pointing out this entire call, doing so in easy to understand, easy to see the difference that that work of the nonprofit is making. But again, it looks different for every organization. So at the ACLU of Nebraska, we know that 2,700, almost 3,000 individuals were able to vote in the last election cycle, specifically because some policy work and some litigation that we were able to do. We brought a case to the Nebraska Supreme Court and we were able to get a decision weeks before voter registration ends. And we were able to clarify and allow people to register to vote and vote who had previously been denied because they had a felony conviction in their history. And so like that is a metric, just one example of a metric. There has been increased ICE or immigration enforcement happening in Nebraska. And I checked last month alone, we had more than 70,000 views of our Know Your Rights information in English and Spanish when engaging with law enforcement, including ICE or immigration officials, particularly information is being accessed by businesses to know what their rights and responsibilities are if they are being presented with a subpoena or a warrant, or perhaps neither, letting them know what their rights and responsibilities are to engage with, law enforcement agencies, but also to protect their team, the community members that are utilizing their services, things of that nature.
Yeah, another thing that comes to mind is I remember when I was on the board, they used to have a little brochure, a little card stock to say "Know your rights," and when police stop you. And as I've been watching Facebook, I'm amazed at the number of police officers who go up and harass people and try to, get in their business, and they're not arresting them. They just go there to, be bad cops and so on. But apparently they don't get good training on. There are some things, if people are not committed a crime, you can't use word like suspicion and all the other stuff they use the bogus to get people entrapped. And then, of course, sometime in Nebraska, we had a situation where they were interrogating young kids without their parents' permission. So part of the transparency accountability is make sure you follow your own procedures, but organizations need to push that back. I'm going to switch up on you. And I know we talked in the past, and I know the organization's been involved in the concept school to prison pipeline. One of your staff back in the day, during my tenure, issued a report about that and showed that there is a correlation between schools and their following, particularly African Americans and Latino kids, into the prison justice system through the juvenile justice system. My point or my question is, what became of that report? And again, a lot of it focused on the Omaha public schools and Lincoln and places where you had a high percentage of our kids getting through the school system to a point. Next thing they were in the system and they never got out. So my point is, what has happened to that? I do know the report did compare whites to African American and Latinos, but has anything happened since that report was produced years ago?
Well, I think that you're right, Ajamal. The report was a good start, but there are many more things that we should be doing to follow up and continuing to push for change, particularly now that we're seeing lawmakers push for the detention of young children and charging young children as adults. So not only continue, on the trajectory that we started with the report, but also mitigate lawmakers who are wanting to push back. For example, in that report, we were able to show that students of color are disciplined more than white students. They're more likely to be disciplined, suspended, or expelled. And then when you look at just law enforcement statistics generally, you're also going to see the same like racial divides. And so one bill that Senator McKinney was able to push through was the preventing of suspension of young children. And I'm talking like kindergarten, first grade, second grade. But of course, like we've now seen other lawmakers trying to repeal that slight, forward progress that was made with Senator McKinney's bill. So we're really taking it one step at a time, not just to move forward, but to mitigate steps backwards here.
One thing that everyone and more is very involved in racial issues. We're probably the only organization in Nebraska that uses anti-racism, racism concepts to challenge systems that are very inherently racist, and we do argue that. But many organizations purport to serve various racial and geographic areas in neighborhoods and groups and so on in our state. First, how many individuals work in ACLU, and what does it make of your staff in terms of racial composition? So in other words, we also hold that litmus test of, it's hard to work with those groups if there's someone on your staff. So what is your numbers, or what do you have in terms of the proportion of your people in your staff?
Yeah, so I'm pasting in the chat our website's aclunebraska.org/staff. So it's going to show you kind of a breakdown of all of our full-time employees. Right now we're at 11 full-time employees. I believe 4 of us are Nebraskans of color, and about the same, about 4 of us are also members of the LGBTQ plus community. And so you'll see, while there's always, improvements that we can make to make sure like our team is reflecting the communities that we're serving and that we want to serve. I do think that we do have a diversity of voices on the team. As far as geographic location, I'd say about half live in Omaha, half live in Lincoln. I'm rural, so we're split up a little bit. We just don't have some of the geographic coverage of greater Nebraska. And so we're making a distinct effort to try to visit and reach out to those areas. Of course, like you're included in some of those conversations, Jamal, but we're definitely aware that we can always do better.
The reason I mentioned it is years ago, Moore did a report. I think Karen Abrams and one of our practical graduate students helped with that report. As the board obviously approved it, But we did a survey of a lot of the nonprofits in Omaha and find out many of them don't have any sense of diversity. One come to mind is Project Harmony. I mean, it reminds you of a white supremacy organization. I can say that publicly and privately because if you look at their leadership over the years, even though they serve people of color in North and South Omaha, they have a very dismal record of that. And so we've challenged organizations that if you're going to be working in communities of color, you don't want to come in as a great white savior and at least have a cutout of President Obama in the room or something. But some of these folks walk in and they have no semblance of that when we have a city that is 35% people of color. So we're pushing that issue of diversity and making sure that you're going to have people who look like the people you serve on your boards and your staff, and not just at the front desk as the tokens at some of these organizations. I'm not going to mention some names, but they know who they are. Switch up, and we only got a couple of, I know much minutes before we open it up, so I want to get as many of these questions as I can, about 10 minutes. Many years of ACLU were known for protecting freedom of speech. And I go back to the Nazi thing where, guys were defending the Nazi and basically say they have a right to do what they want to do. And it became unpopular in the public square. Considering the current mentality, Trump, the red state of Nebraska, historical about some of these daughters of the Confederates who work in these organizations, what is the ACLU's national position on those issues? And my question is, do we really talk about protecting freedom of speech or people who may want our demise? So give me a little bit of background on a little bit of where you guys are at on that concept today.
The case that you're referencing, Ajamal, is still a case that's talked about widely, both inside ACLU and outside of the ACLU. And, there's the argument to be made that ACLU protects everyone's speech, regardless of the popularity of the speech. And so that is, one of the reasons that the ACLU has taken cases like that. The argument against taking cases, for, hate groups or to promote, harmful speech is that we have limited resources. We cannot take every case that comes to us, and we need to focus on the cases where the need is the greatest. And so defending individuals or groups that are impacted the most, that don't have the resources to secure counsel for themselves, like that's where ACLU of Nebraska is going to focus our limited resources. We have case selection guidelines. And so, identifying where the need is the greatest is part of the process. And so it's not just as simple as we defend all speech. There are other, factors that go into it. But I'm confident that we are putting community first when we're making those decisions. We've litigated, like recently, police misconduct. We represented a man who was basically tased just for driving while black is what we were able to find out during litigation. We've represented young girls who were incarcerated within the YRTC system, like the youth detention centers. We've represented a student journalist who was trans, and the newspaper that they wrote for was essentially shut down after they published an article during Pride Month. So we've been able to make our case selection decisions not necessarily just based on the First Amendment right that's at issue, but going through lots of factors to make sure that our resources are going to be put towards community needs.
As you mentioned that, one of the things that come to mind is, all public, all plantation schools, where they're literally starting to erase the concept of race, DEI, people of color. In other words, they won't even have speech. And again, those of us who are more knowledgeable of some of the imbeciles, let me backtrack. Some of the people who are so-called teaching our children, students, they won't invite you in. So basically what they've done, the cancel culture. So you really don't have freedom of speech when you don't allow segments and large people in our communities who have a certain point of view, regardless. And again, I think part of it happened back because they lack the moderation skills to navigate difference of opinions and so on. And so we got to do a better job of getting ideals in the marketplace, not only at the university, but also in the public schools, because again, some of those students come out, they have no clue about their culture, their history, because some of those people who suffer from white fragility don't want to talk about racism or white supremacy, or the things that we have, which is abundant in our state, in our police departments and law enforcement, our judicial system. I'm going to switch up again because again, I'm chasing time. If someone wanted to become a member of the ACLU or help with some of your mission causes, how might they do that? Mindy?
Our website offers a lot of ways to get involved. So, of course, I would love for everyone to become an ACLU of Nebraska member. And so that is a small monthly donation, whatever feels right to you. And
Wait,
then you're,
back up. We're talking specifics. So you're saying it doesn't cost you a lot of money to be a member of ACLU? What are we talking? What I can afford to give? Is that what you say, or is there a minimum? Talk to me more.
yeah, I'll put the link in the chat, but it's really what is meaningful to you. So if it's a small amount, it's a small amount and that's okay. I'm a member, I'm a donor, and I do get calls every once in a while saying, is that still the right amount for you? You know, and it is. And so that decision is not necessarily made by me with a certain scale or, different options, but it's made by the members themselves. But even if membership is not an option or the right option for an individual at this moment in time, there's lots of other ways to stay connected. Um, at our website, aclunebraska.org, I'm really encouraging people to sign up to be a smart justice advocate. That means when there are like criminal legal issues or the rights of people who are currently incarcerated, like at issue, and we want to, engage with the community about maybe contacting their lawmakers or watching a film screening on something that's gonna like a film that highlights the injustice of solitary confinement. Like the smart justice advocates are going to get the first news and information on those type of updates. Follow our socials as well. Like we push out a lot of updates on what we're seeing in the courts and, with policymakers and just in the community through our social media channels.
The reason I find that interesting because I know the Heartland Family Service, I was talking to John Jeanette years ago to be on their board of directors. And this is years ago, he had to give $2,000. Now, what he did say, you can get donations or there might be somebody sponsor you, but you're not going to have a lot of diverse folks who are low income or live in certain parts of town who have working poor to give $2,000 just sit in a monthly meeting, hear a bunch of people talk about nothing or talk about insignificant things related to their life. So if nonprofits are serious about serving the community, they need to stop making them like a private club or making it that you don't include certain groups, particularly if you say you serve all Nebraska, you serve all people in the community, because again, there are filters you can apply that can keep people out. And we've seen that through many court systems in our system and so on. One of the things we're down to the last minute before we open it up. What is something you guys are working on the next coming months or years that you want people to know about for the agency?
So I think that's going to go back to when I introduced the new strategic plan. One of the central focuses that came out of the strategic plan is just kind of reacclimating to the smart justice work. We've just welcomed a new acting legal director who worked as a public defender for almost 20 years and really just brings with her the ability to start tackling some of the more systemic issues that we're facing in Nebraska in our criminal legal system in a way that hopefully can impact not just an individual one at a time, but like Nebraskans generally. We've also know that there's a lot of ground to make, softening people's hearts and minds, because even though, like I was talking about earlier, it's hard for us to talk about things surrounding incarceration and whatnot, we all know that Nebraskans are impacted by incarceration, whether or not we've experienced it or immediate family members experienced it, someone in our network has. And so just really focusing on the smart justice work, we're also going to continue to work on, like we talked about earlier, the school to prison pipeline work, which is wrapped in the smart justice, but we're also going to be working with schools to implement new natural hair tribal regalia protections for students to make sure students can go to school as their whole selves and not face any different treatment or discrimination as a result of that. And then, of course, next year's midterms. So we're already having a lot of conversations about how to get the vote out, particularly folks that newly have their voting rights restored. And we want to make sure that Nebraskans who are in jail have access to the votes just like everyone else. So I think, a lot of things to look out for. We talked about proposed legislation. So there's a few bills that are still alive that we really want to highlight for next year. And yeah, working with other organizations like MORE is also another priority for us as well.
Quickly, I'm gonna switch over, but when you use the word smart justice, do the smart justice people or that project determine their topics, or is it something that comes from the board or the staff? Because use the word smart justice as if it's an entity that works on a kind of some separate agenda, the way you said it.
Yeah, so the term smart justice was actually new for me. Before I started at the ACLU, I had never heard it before. I had always heard criminal law reform or, or prisoners' rights. But when we at the ACLU of Nebraska use smart justice, it's it's a broader term that kind of works the beginning, middle, and end of people's experience working with the criminal legal system.
Gotcha.
So it is not developed or coined by me. We're just embracing it and trying to use it in a way to capture the spectrum of the system and not just one specific piece of it.
Good, good, good. Well, we're right up on that 30-minute mark. And so what I'm going to do is open it up to people who are participating if they want to ask you a question or respond to some comment and let you go from there. So folks, we're going to open it up. Either you can type it out or talk directly to Mindy about what you want to say. Karen, did you want to say that directly? I see you wrote it in.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Hi. Thanks for coming tonight, Mindy. Yeah, I was wanted to maybe pick your brain a little bit more about ways to increase engagement with the community between ACLU and more. And I was thinking about, I don't know, maybe you can brainstorm a little bit with us on ways that we might be able to create some synergy. Um, our mission is around anti-racism and racial justice. So that's where we would want to focus. But can you think of any possible ways that we might be able to create opportunities for greater community action?
I would love that, Karen. And I do think that there are a multitude of opportunities. I think that we have the gift of Ajamal, who can pluck one and make us move forward with it. So really excited about that, to have that like in this partnership. But I do think that when other organizations might feel like they have to shy away from talking about race and talking about race equity and the things that y'all at More are really good about, I think it's an opportunity not for us to do the same, but to amplify each other and support each other and making sure that the information is out there, that we're using a race equity lens in other work, even if it's not directly related to race equity. But we know that all of our civil rights and human rights and civil liberties work, it intersects with racial justice. And so working together to say it and to point it out and make folks know that this is not just a unintended consequence of our work. It's like we're actually intentionally meaning to move the needle here. And doing so in partnership with other organizations makes it so much powerful and sustainable.
Thank you.
Other folks, other feedback. By the way, Mindy, how many legal folks you have on your staff? How many people are attorneys that practice law in Nebraska?
So we have, so I'm an attorney, and then we have 3 other attorneys on staff. And then we have some law clerks, so current law students, and then another intern who's interested, actually got accepted to law school, but is deferring it for a year. So not just attorneys on staff, but we're also we take it really seriously to kind of work on that pipeline of attorneys that are interested in this work and remaining in Nebraska to do this work.
Yeah. Well, the reason I raise that is because we have been working on the issue of legal desert and just the aspect of many low-income families and families of color have never interacted with attorneys on a decent level, except those ones who chase you down. We call them ambulance chasers. They want your money after a car accident, but you never see them in our community or working with you. And then sometimes we got some shyster lawyers who basically take advantage of low-income families by charging an inordinate amount of money or promising them this, and then at the end of the day, something happens, they're not able to deliver. So one of the things I think can help with lawyers, particularly in Nebraska, is how do you flatten the pyramid so that more of our community may know more about their legal rights and attorneys and things that they could do. And sometimes you don't even know which court to go to or what, how do you want to call it? You don't even know how to litigate or go with it because you don't know if it's civil, criminal, whatever. And especially when the police officer does all the brutality, some of us that know you can actually sue them individually in some states, and also there's other ways. So there's just some information, public information that we need from both the Nebraska Law College as well as Creighton, because I don't rarely see them in our community offering pro bono or free community forums and education. But again, that's another thing we're pushing, is getting a lot of organizations to share the love and not be in their cubbyhole or their plexiglass office and so on. Other questions, other feedback, other people who may have a question.
And Mindy, also Binding here. Question for you regarding some of the legislative work that you guys do. Is there anything that you want to see in the upcoming legislative session in terms of bills being introduced, in terms of policies? I mean, what is your position and your organization's stance on some of the bills that maybe you want to see introduced in the next legislative session?
Yeah. So next legislative session, starting in January of 26, is going to be the short session of a two, like we just finished a longer session, and we're going to go into a continuation of the shorter session to finish out the 2-year session. So what that means is we still have some bills that are alive that were introduced this past session that can still moving forward. And so 3 of those bills, and thank you, Pozo, for the softball question. 3 of those bills that are alive that we would love y'all to pay attention to and to help with whatever support you can throw at it is LB 99. That is a bill that was introduced by Senator Spivey, and it is going to implement the human rights standard of limiting time that Nebraskans can spend in solitary confinement. It would really just be adopting the Mandela rules to limit solitary confinement to 15 days. And we also want to eliminate double bunking in solitary confinement, and we want to eliminate.
Wait, explain a little bit. What do you mean when you use the word double bunking? Some people know what you're talking about. What does that mean when we say double bunking in solitary confinement?
Yeah, it's one of the most dangerous situations I think that folks in Nebraska can face during incarceration, but it's when you're being sent to be isolated, which studies show that even just a short period of isolation causes like identifiable damage and PTSD type of symptoms. But you're sent to isolation for punishment, and then if there's not enough space in the individual, like solitary confinement cells, sometimes they'll throw in another bunk and have 2 people that are being isolated together, even though that is not what that space was designed for. And it increases the risk of that person. So there's risk of harm to that person, regardless of whether they're double bunked in a cell or not. But then when you add another individual who's also experiencing the solitary confinement or that form of torture, it increases the risk to both of those individuals. And so we would like to have double bunking like eliminated completely. But if you look at the statistics and the data, you'll see just horrifying, heart-wrenching stories of people that have lost their life as a result of double bunking. And when you're in solitary, you're in a tiny cell for usually 23 hours a day.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm not just talking about brief periods of isolation, like it's intense deprivation. And I've heard stories of when folks are not in isolation. So for that, that last hour of the 24-hour day, sometimes the people are not in the cell, but they're maybe chained to the floor or something like that. And so LB 99 is one of those bills that it's still alive. We need to raise some awareness of the harms of solitary confinement. And I can just vulnerably say that even though my own father experienced solitary confinement, it was not until I came to the ACLU and learned more about the torturous impact of prolonged isolation that I realized there are Nebraskans that are being tortured every single day, and most of us don't know it, and we certainly don't know how to talk about it. Wow. So I would definitely suggest following LB 99. Senator Holcroft, we're talking about, a Republican senator, and bipartisan support for LB 215. It cleared the first round of vote, but it hasn't passed, and it cleared very narrowly. So we need some support around it to keep it moving. But it provides a process for Nebraskans who are serving really long sentences to have a commutation or to have another chance to present their case. And the reason that I believe Senator Holdcroft and some of his allies are behind this is because the brain science that is coming out that talks about decisions you made when you are 21, 22, 20, all the way up. They say your brain's not fully formed until what, 26, probably later. But if you're getting a 50 plus sentence for a decision that you made when you were 21 or even younger, that should not impact you for the rest of your life or not take away your ability for, some to present, redeeming aspects that you've been able to achieve for yourself. So that LB 215 we're supporting and want it to be beefed up more, but it is definitely a great start. And then the other one I want to mention, because it kind of ties into police involved killings and misconduct, is the non-safety related traffic stop limitations. So we know that police stops and interactions, on the side of the road are very dangerous for the individuals in the vehicle, and law enforcement both. And for passerby, like it's a very dangerous situation. And so we are trying to, with Senator McKinney's bill that he introduced, limit law enforcement's ability for those stops. So if it's not a safety related stop, it should not happen. These are things like if you have something hanging from your windshield mirror, that is not a safety related stop unless it's something extreme, and that should not give a law enforcement officer the ability to just stop and find out if something else is going on, because it creates, again, this really dangerous situation that is not necessary for safety reasons.
One of the things that come to mind is you look at the Department of Corrections Facebook page, so you think it's a hotel you want to go live in, and then you see that dark-skinned warden up there posing with pictures every other day with some people about the great job they're doing. But at the other side, it's a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde place, and they don't have any accountability once they get people in there. So I really think they need to deal with that. But I want to follow real quickly with something that was raised a little bit is when you're looking at local issues. Are you going to do anything to push back at this big, crazy, beautiful bill that the president talked about? In other words, we're talking about local issues, state issues, but what is the ACLU national? What are you guys doing on the federal level? Because again, that bill is going to have a lot of draconian effect on Nebraskans, economic and so on. Again, I just want to throw it out. Are you going to work on pushing back on that piece of garbage that got pushed forward down our throats as a country?
Yeah, definitely. I think at all three levels, federal, state, and local. So at the federal level, ACLU Nebraska, well, ACLU National is not stopping. They're continuing to move forward to fight against, to mitigate whatever way possible. We're also here in Nebraska working on reaching out to our representatives over their August break. So the August recess, we're planning some events, meetings with our members of Congress to make sure that they know the will of Nebraskans is not encompassed in that legislation, the big, beautiful bill. Also, Medicaid's birthday happens right around the August recess. And so I think that's a good opportunity to educate folks about the importance of healthcare coverage and how Medicaid was started, and all of those things. So we're definitely looking at those federal
Gotcha.
movements going forward.
Yeah, we're talking about state stuff, and I want to say, Karen, you have a question out. Can you say that or articulate what that's about, Karen? I really like that question.
Yeah, so I mean, I have a feeling, but I want to know, what are the facts? I have this feeling that that people who and organizations that already are white supremacist are taking advantage of the national environment to express white supremacist views and intentions more than they ever have in an open way. But I'm not sure if that's what ACLU is seeing and hearing in reality in Nebraska. And so I wanted to kind of get a sense from you about that.
I think you're right, Karen. I think this is something that we're going to see more of, not just in Nebraska, but across the country. It's just kind of the phenomenon that when something becomes more popular, it's easier to say it, even if you've been hiding it for a really long time. So I think you're right. Personally, what I have noticed is not the blatant white supremacist comments or actions, but rather the muting of the opposite. So organizations were vocal about their commitment to being equitable and prioritizing racial justice and using a race equity line, all of those things. I've seen organizations, muting those like overt commitments, and I understand why, for the most part, to protect revenue and funding sources. But if that trend is catchy, it's very easy to go from muting to, being more affirmatively vocal in the opposite of what they had previously been doing.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's definitely the performative anti-racism, with everybody posting some kind of DEI mission statement on their websites. That stuff for sure has gone away. So it's very discouraging to know that some of these systemic issues are also bubbling up uh, in organizations that have sort of traditionally been more, what we would say liberal or progressive. They're also just zipping the lip out of fear, and that is no ally. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks.
And that kind of goes back to your original point about what can we do. And since the ACLU does not take any government funding from any level, um, when I was a new ED, I thought, oh my gosh, how is this going to happen? And right now I am really grateful that we do not have to worry about any of that mitigation, because that doesn't align with our organization's values, but it's not even something that I have to think about, because we're not risking losing any of that government funding.
It's
Thank you.
interesting y'all both should say that, because we've noticed that those organizations who get certain funds from certain people cannot talk. I mean, they've lost their vocal cards, or they're so afraid. And again, I use UNO's example. One of my colleagues out there said they've scrubbed all their web pages, and they're even afraid to mention race. I mean, are you serious? And so they're using all subterfuges, but even then, the people who have those jobs, and I use the University of Nebraska Medical Center, they have dark-skinned people there who are even afraid to even advance why they were hired in the first place. So one of the things we got to do is help people get their tongue back, or get rid of that laryngitis that they develop when it comes to dealing with some issues in our community. The thing that blows my mind, and I'm really concerned, is people who are retired, who get no federal funds, they're independently employed or whatever, and they're still afraid to speak truth to justice when they see how we're treating the immigrants, we're treating the people who may be undocumented, you name it. And people walk around with their faces covered up like they're members of the Ku Klux Klan. I'm like, how does that happen in Nebraska? So I really would love to see more people come to the plate. And again, I don't know if they're religious or have strong beliefs, but some kind of way. You can't sit on the sidelines as so many people did historically and all these other genocidal, degrading things. But again, at the end of the day, talk is cheap and action is higher than just articulating some of these issues. So yeah, other questions, other feedback, other folks. By the way, one question came up in one of our meetings. I was going to ask you is, do these things coalesce, the issue that's going on with immigration and the undocumented folks and some of the racial justices we did? I remember Trump played that up front when he says they're taking a black job, and Michelle came back at him. But my point is, people are pitting brown and black and immigrants against people who've been here in institution. I know some of us fall for the okie dokie, but from your vantage point, how should we articulate or challenge that divide and rule mentality that the billionaires play against working class people, and people who are struggling for their families against the elites and the billionaires and millionaires?
That's a great question, Ajamal. I think actually one of the first times you and I met was when I was doing a presentation on our immigration legal system. And I think that one of the reasons that it's really easy for groups to be pitted against each other by who you're talking about, like powerful people who are using it to their advantage, is because the immigration legal system in our country is so confusing. It's so complicated. It doesn't make logical sense. And so it is easy to kind of buy into some of the narratives that are being spread by the powerful, like, oh, this person didn't do it the right way. But when you just learn even just the bare bones about how complicated and exclusive our immigration legal system is and how it doesn't make sense, that helps. I think that is just making sure people have access to the realities of our immigration legal system, I think is part of the work that we need to do. And then I think one of the things that you've said a couple times is just the lack of our ability to have difficult conversations, our lack of like appropriate moderation. So I think like making sure we have the information about the realities of the immigration legal system, along with the confidence, the skills, and the support to engage in these conversations makes a big difference. But even like immigrants that could be very similar, like face the same type of persecution in their home country, but because of where their home country was located, one person might have options to apply for immigration form of relief, and one person might not. It just depends on whether they had access to a refugee camp or how they got here and what the law was the year that they entered. And it's so complicated that you can look at your neighbor and think, what I experienced was just as bad, if not worse. How come I have no options? Well, it's because the complexities of our legal system make it such. And so it just helps pit groups against each other.
Wow. Yeah, because I see in Omaha where we have 35% people of color, black, brown, obviously Latino, Native American, Asians, and so on, African Americans. We don't have a unified voice. As Malcolm X once said, our problem is unity and collective working together. And I think the other side has done a better job of organizing. And so we sometimes have, as they say, pit each other against each other, not work. And again, if we come together, we could change the scope of history in this community. And I got to keep reminding some of our so-called young advocates who are agreeing that history is not always determined by individuals that are backing up. And so, you can write a letter, do what you want as an individual, and beat your chest or whatever. But if you don't have the community and neighborhood and families all rallying around you, we're going to see the transformation of our wretched situation for many of the oppressed people in our country. So those are issues we're going to deal with. We're down to the last 7 or 8 minutes or so, and I wanted to, before we close, ask you in the sense of, when you look at this administration that we see in Washington, and you look what's happening in Nebraska, and you look at rural Nebraska, you just alluded to that. Are there other organizations that we need to join forces with to work with pulling the rural community and the urban communities together? Because I remember a time in Nebraska, we were a blue state, okay? And there were things that people wouldn't do. And now we're moving toward being like Texas and Florida. So how can we bring some of those people from your vantage point who live in outstate Nebraska, Scottsbluff, Shadra, Verdigris, Table Rock, you name it, into some of the issues where we're on a united front and not necessarily dealing with the elected politicians who may be jaded or maybe running for office all the time? So my question is, who's out there we can work with, or can we do a statewide push a progressive thing in Nebraska from your vantage point?
I think there's a lot of opportunity, Ajmal. I was just in Kearney last week or the week before, thinking I was going to present to a very small group. Like I was thinking 5 maybe, and the room filled. We had to bring chairs. I'm talking over 100 in Kearney. So I think that we just, some of us, think that there's the rural urban divide. But I think if we just frame things, from a human perspective, from a Nebraskan perspective, because we are all facing threats to our rights and freedoms. Some are specific to our geography, but most are not. And so just being able to talk to people on the human to human level about our rights and freedoms, that we all, like, even though I might not feel a certain way about a particular right, I am always going to fight for the rights of an individual human. And I think a lot of Nebraskans are like that. Like, I might not agree with XYZ, but I really think it's your right to make that decision. I think if we can start to get out of our silos where we're just using the language that we feel comfortable with and advocating for the specific rights that we want to, but expand into a more broad effort to be aligned and, like you said, to pull together when we need to, because that's where the power really exists. And it's got to overcome all the divides, not just geography, but I think in Nebraska the geographic divide has really stopped us from doing some of the power building that we can do.
Good. For our last few minutes, any closing comments for our participants and viewing audience? Mindy, do you have any closing comments for our viewing audience or anything? Last words you want to say?
Oh, I mean, I was just gonna thank more for what y'all are doing. Like I know, there's an Omaha focus, but the work that you're doing can be utilized across the state. And I know you're also, working on addressing the legal desert issue, which obviously affects the entire state of Nebraska. So just really grateful to be in the conversation and looking forward to some of the ideas that Karen and the rest of your board might have to, do something more in the future.
Well, Mindy Rush Chipman, I appreciate you being on here today. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and again to broaden our scope to learn about other nonprofits and organizations who are progressive, trying to change the climate where we're facing today. I want to make a couple of shameless plugs. Next week, Karen and I are going to do a show. We're going to talk about more and some things we're working on and things we've been excited about. We're going to bring some very controversial, to us they're logical, but for some people, they're going to be some hot topics. And so we invite people to join us to challenge back and push back on some issues that we've been working on. Again, we're going to uncover and deconstruct the elephant on the table and not dance on the table. So that's coming up. We're going to have, the following week, we're going to have Kimberly Barnes, who's working with Native Omaha week and so on. And so we're going to have her talk about what they do, why that's important to the African American community, and even the large community of people who come back to Omaha or to Nebraska annually every 2 years, just to kind of reacquaint themselves with old friends and people they have seen in many years. And then the other person, and this is probably one of the most exciting one also, we're going to Evan Fletcher Sass. We're going to talk about his book, North Omaha, hashtag Blacks in North Omaha. I just finished reading this book. It's a fascinating book about what all the great people in our state of color, particularly African Americans, who've been fighting for issues in the 1860s and 50s and things. And they don't teach that in our local plantation schools or education system, but it's a fascinating book. He's a Canadian by birth. He's in Canada now, but we're going to interview him about the book and some of the things that he's done to tell our histories, particularly in North Omaha, and also how can we get more people to tell their family history and talk about all the great things of those unsung histories. I mean, advocates have done to help make our communities better. So we got some things coming up in the future. We hope you would join us on some of these Wednesdays, and some of these programs. Most of them we'll have on Facebook Live, and then we'll post them on Moore's webpage. You can go back and watch them later. And some of you may find surprising that most of the people who watch our programs watch it after the fact, because again, in the summertime, people don't always join in. But I really appreciate the participation of folks here, and we hope that you've enjoyed this edition of Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. Join us again next week as we say, may the force be with you, Baroko.